I'm going to read a book called Between Beirut and the Moon by Bakhti. This is... A young boy comes of age within the confines of post-Civil War Beirut, with conflict, a comedy lurking around every corner. Adam dreams of becoming an astronaut, but who has ever heard of an Arab on the moon? He battles with his father, a book-hoarding journalist with a penchant for writing eulogies. His closest friend, Basil, a Druze who is said to worship goats and believe in reincarnation, and a host of other misfits and miscreants in a city attempting recover from years of political and military violence. Adam's youth oscillates from laugh-out-loud escapades to near-death encounters as he struggles to understand the turbulent and elusive city he calls home. Set amidst the country's sectarian divisions as it attempts to recover from decades of political violence and civil war, Between Beirut and the Moon charts a young boy's near-death encounters with a colorful cast and comic escapades, a unique debut. Chapter 1. I heard this theory once, that if you toss a newborn into a swimming pool, he'll come out the other side kicking. I find that highly improbable. My father, or so I believe, has always been a strong advocate of this theory. Instead of water, however, he chose books, and instead of infants, he chose the entirety of his sons' and daughters' combined childhoods. In more than one sense, my sister and I have been kicking through books for most of our lives. The idea was that if you expose a child to literature long and hard enough, he'll grow up wanting to be a writer, a critic, an editor, or the J.R.R. Tolkien Professor of English Literature and Language at the University of Oxford. Of course, I wanted to be an astronaut. "Don't be ridiculous," he'd say. "Who ever heard of an Arab on the moon?" "I'll be the first one," I replied at once, instead of taking the usual route of trying to look as non-ridiculous as possible, for my father's liking. "You're flat-footed. They don't allow flat-footed Arabs on the moon," he remarked casually, his face hidden behind this morning's An-Nahar daily. "It's illegal." "Who said?" "Jesus, Muhammad, Christ said. That's who." That was another thing my father would say, with unerring regularity, as if Jesus' middle name had always been Muhammad and everyone in the world had thus far simply failed to spot this most obvious truth. One expected nothing less of a Muslim man who had forged an unholy alliance with a Christian woman against the wishes of his now irritated family and his now pissed-off God, whom one would have thought must have known in advance and ought to have had ample time to cope. "How many times have I told you not to dash your son's dreams?" "How many times have I told you not to dash your son's dreams?" my mother cautioned, as she made her way towards the balcony, cigarette in mouth and all. She was being generous today. Usually, she would spend most of her leisure time in the living room creating a cloud of smoke in front of her and then struggling to make out the images being displayed on the TV. "He can do anything he sets his mind to." "Next, you'll be telling him he can walk on water. God knows we have a hard enough time getting from one country to another without being held back for a cavity search. They'll shove an effing Hubble telescope, mother and father, up his backside before they let him get on that space shuttle," he said. Mother and father is a colloquial term used in Lebanon to express the idea of something whole or complete. For instance, the weight of the explosion knocked the man, mother and father, right out the window, as men in Beirut occasionally are, or the building collapsed, mother and father, to the ground, as buildings in Beirut occasionally do. Chapter 2, A Lesson in Buddhism. When in school I was grilled on the subject of my religion by my classmates, I would respond with a shrug, as bewildering to my inquisitors as it was to me. I knew that church was for Christians and mosque for Muslims. I knew this because most Christians and church began with letters C and H, and because both Muslim and mosque begin with the letters M and O. If you should choose to spell Muslim as such, but don't. I knew that the mosque was the one that smelt of feet on any given day, but particularly on Friday. And not nice nail-polished lady feet either, but thick-skinned and hairy man feet. I knew this because my friend Mohammed was Muslim, and he smelt of feet on any given day, but particularly on Friday. Mohammed had devised a game, or so he told us. He hadn't. All he had done was learn it off of his big brother. Christian or Muslim? He asked, one day during break, extending two clenched and clammy fists and imploring me to pick one. I picked Muslim because in Arabic it means peace, and I reasoned no harm could come out of peace. The Arabic word for Christian bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the Arabic word for crocodile, and I was not especially fond of crocodiles at that time. Mohammed slapped me straight across my left cheek with his clammy right hand and ran. He hid behind the teacher's desk for what seemed like more than 10 minutes, and I eventually gave up looking for him and forgave him instead. The next day I asked him where he was all afternoon, and he said he was hiding behind the teacher's desk for the first 10 minutes and had since then found his mother, walked home with her, done his homework, watched Boy Meets World, went to sleep, woke up, brushed his teeth, skipped breakfast, and walked straight to school. Nothing, he said, before reciting the above activities to me in that same order. From a distance I observed, as Mohammed extended his still clammy fist to an older boy whom I had only known by name. Mohammed then struck the older boy, Bolus, across his right cheek. Bolus made an instinctive gesture as if to react. His arm was half raised and in pole position to strike when he slowly and gradually began to lower it. You're a Christian, Bolus. You can't slap back. You see, those are the rules of the game, said Mohammed, smiling triumphantly. I know it's not fair, he continued. Don't blame me. Take it up with your own God. It was true that my mother had never made to slap me across the face, nor had my father for that matter. But it was also true that the sole of her shoe had narrowly missed the tip of my nose and the top of my head on countless different occasions. Of course, on these occasions, the sole of my mother's shoe had long since left my mother's foot and was making its own pilgrimage from her hand to whichever part of my body it had set out to reach. My mother may have been Christian, but her shoe almost definitely was not Christian. Am I Muslim or Christian? I asked my Christian mother over dinner. The family had been sitting before the TV set, each with a tray on his or her lap, for at least half an hour watching my father's favorite comedy sketch program, Basmeet El Watan, which literally translates to the death of a nation, or alternatively, the smiles of a nation, depending on the manner in which one chooses to read the title. The TV set was old with vinyl wood varnish and knobs rather than buttons, and my little sister's nimble fingers rather than a remote control. The story which my parents had upheld thus far was that either my sister or I had hidden the remote control somewhere within the house when we were young and forgotten about it. They had searched for the remote countless times before, of course, and were eventually forced to concede that it was lost forever. We, my sister and I, had to pay the price for our mistake by getting up to change the channel every time one of our parents decided they didn't like the program they were watching. As I was almost twice my sister's age at the time, it often fell to her to change the channel. Technically, neither, my father replied absent-mindedly, drawing a stern look from my mother, and failing to notice both her stern look and my concerned expression. Both, Adam, my mother said, seeking to reassure me in some way. Both, Adam, is what she said. Yes, but if I had to pick one, which would it be? I asked her again. I heard Buddhism is all right. Try that, my father said, smiling and winking to himself. How many times have I told you not to confuse your son? My mother remarked. I'm only laying out his options in front of him, darling, he replied. The conversation then went in the direction of Buddhism and how they, the Buddhists, worship a short, fat, and bald man who looked remarkably like my uncle, my uncle Gamal, and who had spent most of his days naked and attempting to lift himself off the ground without the effort of moving his legs. He sounded to me like a more obese version of Jesus, but without the long and fair hair and the glimmering blue eyes. Glimmering blue eyes? Where do you think Jesus was born? Sweden? My father interjected, now turning his attention away from the TV set for the first time in the conversation. Australia, my sister replied, with an air of authority which belied her tender age of 6. Belied. Why Australia, Farah? My father asked, tugging at one of her ponytails playfully. Only my father called my sister Farah. It means mouse. I think it means more than mouse, doesn't it? Excuse me, that's not in the book. Why not? She said, adjusting her ponytail. The general consensus was that as God would not have consciously and willingly overseen the evolution of the kangaroo, he must have turned his back on Australia for a good few thousand years, and so could not have sent his own son to that overgrown island 2,000 or so years ago. The only link my sister and I could find between Jesus and Australia, years later, would be Mel Gibson, an Australian actor and director who directed the movie Passion of the Christ. My sister maintains to this day that her answer was prophetic. He was born in the Middle East. He was probably tanned, had a long black beard, thick black eyebrows, and dark black eyes, my father said, running his thumb and index finger over his thick black mustache, like Bin Laden. A week or so later, as he dropped me off to school, my father leaned over and explained that there were quite a few advantages to being a child of a mixed marriage. Chief among them, the ability to switch back and forth between both religions at one's own convenience. By that point, Muhammad's game had spread, and most children, Muslim and Christian, had been slapped across their cheek at least once. Whenever we saw two of our classmates chasing one another during recess, we knew that they were both Muslim and that the one being chased had just slapped his chaser straight across the face. The Christian boys, as you would expect, did not like this game very much, but none of them slapped back or chased their aggressor because they were Christian, and Christians must turn the other cheek. Or so Muhammad and countless other Muslim boys had told them. I want to play again, I told Muhammad, who shrugged his shoulders and extended his arms to reveal both his clenched and clammy fists. Muslim or Christian? Christian, I said, smiling. I thought you said you were Muslim. I did, but I changed my mind. My mum's Christian, and I can do that, I replied victoriously. Muhammad slapped me across the face and stood there laughing with 4 or 5 other Muslim boys, all of whom had latched themselves onto Muhammad ever since he'd introduced his new popular game to the playground. I did not wait for Muhammad to finish his laugh before reaching over and slapping him with the back of my hand across his right cheek as hard as I could. That's how it works, he said. Oh, that's not how it works, he said. You're a Christian, you can't slap back. Ask your God. I asked him, I thought, and he said it's fine by him if I go back to being Muslim for the next few minutes. But I didn't say it. I didn't say anything. I slapped Muhammad again and again. The 4th slap knocked him off his feet. He made a helpless effort to punch back as he fell to the floor, swinging his fist in the general direction of my face. I pinned him to the floor and began to punch his face wildly. I imagined that he was an alien life form which I had come across in one of my journeys to outer space. Whole soul aim was to spread a disease that would divide the entire human race into tiny little groups of men and women who fought endlessly amongst themselves and achieved progress only sporadically. None of his newly acquired friends came to his aid, and they were joined by more spectators, mostly young Christian boys, who were led to the scene by the mere smell of retribution. As I sat there in the principal's office thinking about what I'd done, my mother and father were escorted to the leather chairs either side of the one I had been occupying for the best part of an hour. Sit. They're not just for decoration, you know, said the principal, Miss Iman, tapping one of the leather chairs on its back and looking up at my father. My father does not take too kindly to being told what to do by anyone, especially marginally younger women, and would likely have been much more cooperative throughout the remainder of the meeting had she, the principal, politely asked him to please take a seat without tapping any one of the leather chairs on the back, and without making a remark about their function in an office. I was glad she had done both. "Are you happy about what you've done, Adam?" asked the principal, leaning forward and staring me intently in the eye. She was one of those women who had once been startlingly beautiful, but who had since deliberately taken the decision to cut her hair short, develop myopia, and age a few years in order to be taken more seriously by her male colleagues. "Yes," I replied, knowing that it was perhaps not the answer she was looking for. "You see, the boy shows no remorse," she said, addressing my parents and filling them in on the details of the incident. "It seems to me that my son was involved in a fight with another boy. Now, where is that other... It seems to me that my son was involved in a fight with another boy. Now, where is that other boy?" my father inquired. "Your son broke his nose. He's in the hospital," she replied, raising her right eyebrow. "That hardly seems fair." "What? That your son broke the boy's nose, or that the boy is receiving medical treatment at the hospital?" "My son's arms are covered with little scratches, which clearly have been left unattended," my father said, putting both his hands on the desk before him and adjusting his seating position. "This boy fights like a little girl." I chuckled and received a stern look from both my mother and the principal, who evidently thought that my father's remark was neither funny nor was I entitled to laugh at it. I looked at my arm and noticed the tiny scratches for the first time. They hurt more now that I was aware of then. A tear must have escaped me, as both their expressions soon softened. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" the principal asked, looking straight at me. Miss Iman's "What do you want to be when you grow up?" lecture was infamous throughout the school. There was not a student summoned into her office who had not been on the receiving end of one. It went something like this: "What do you want to be when you grow up? A doctor, engineer, lawyer, businessman, teacher? And do you think doctors, engineers, lawyers, businessmen, teachers punch one another in the face? No, exactly. Now apologize to your classmate." To say that it is inherently flawed is an understatement. That the moral fiber of a human being is essentially tied to his occupation is ridiculous. Even as 11-year-olds, we were well aware of that. "An astronaut," I replied. "An astronaut?" she repeated, turning over to look at my mother, who shrugged her shoulders and smiled politely. "Who ever heard of an Arab astronaut on the moon?" Who ever heard of an Arab on the moon? Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father slap his forehead audibly with the palm of his right hand, then slap his right hand with the palm of his left one. "The point is, you shouldn't resort to violence every time someone insults your religion. It's why the entire country has gone to the dogs. Is that clear?" asked the principal. "Yes, Miss Iman," I replied, occupying myself with the elaborate pattern of the Persian carpet on the floor. "Hold on. You've had a student spreading sectarianism around the school for the past month, and you are concerned that my son has found an unorthodox way of putting an end to it?" my father asked. "Unorthodox? It's completely orthodox, Mr. Najjar. That's the problem," she said, somewhat impatiently. "This is not the first time your son has been involved in acts of indiscipline, or blasphemy for that matter. Just last week, he asked the civic studies teacher whether Jesus Christ existed in the same way that Santa Claus did." "Well, with all due respect, Miss Iman, what the hell was Jesus Christ doing in a civic studies class at a secular school anyway?" my father asked. "Calm down," my mother said, nudging her husband in the ribs. "And a month or so ago, tell your father what you said about the prophet," she demanded, addressing me and completely ignoring my father's question. "I asked the Arabic teacher whether, after commanding Muhammad to read, whether God then smacked him on the back of the head with the Quran, like you did to me with Oliver Twist," I said, staring bluntly at my father. "In all honesty, son, if Muhammad was anything like you, then God must have done that, yes," he replied. "I will not have blasphemy in my office," said Mrs. Iman. "Do you know who I am, Miss Iman?" My father had just invoked the quintessential Lebanese statement which often preceded an indisputable declaration of war between two mostly rational adults. It doesn't matter if you're a second-rate citizen living from paycheck to paycheck with a modest background, no ancestors to speak of, and earning barely enough money to feed your 8 hungry children. In Lebanon, you will ask this question of anyone who rubs you the wrong way and wait for them to ask you it back. Do you know who I am, Mr. Najjar? Of course, neither of them knew who the other really was. Neither of them really cared to find out. My mother, suspecting as much, stood up, apologized to Miss Iman, told her that I would be severely punished at home, and asked for Mohammed's mother's phone number so that she may call her and apologize personally. I don't know what my mother said, but I never heard from Mohammed or his mother again. When we got home, my parents sent me straight to my room to think about what I'd done. A few minutes later, my father opened my bedroom door, walked in, and locked it behind him. Your mother and I agreed that the only way to punish you is this, he said, holding his black leather belt in his right hand. But I didn't. I began to object and stopped as soon as I saw my father's index finger being placed firmly on my lips. Jump and scream, he whispered, deliberately missing me and landing hard lashes on the bedsheets. Never be afraid to fight for what you believe in, or defend those with less courage or intellect than yourself, my father said, lashing furiously at the bed. But always stop short of breaking your opponent's nose. You know you've gone astray. Scream when there's blood involved. I'm sorry, I said, bouncing as highly as I could and screaming over his words. Stop, that's enough, stop, my mother implored, banging on the bedroom door. Do not hesitate to blasphemy if religion happens to stand in the way of truth or knowledge, but do not do so intentionally to provoke others, he continued, inciting me to shout louder with his left hand. Apologies louder to those whom you have wronged, but never wait till long enough to be told to do it by others. It takes the gloss off of the apology. Open this door right now, or so help me God, I will burst through it, my mother shouted. For a moment my father stood there before me, panting and trying to catch his breath. Then he unlocked the door, swung it open, and walked past my mother without saying another word. Okay, I've read enough. It's 22 minutes. Next chapter is Al-Jahiz and Monsieur Mermier. Probably didn't pronounce that right.